Margaret Sullivan wiped the sweat from her forehead as she hung the last piece of laundry on the line. The Texas sun was already blazing hot, even though it was barely 9 in the morning. She looked out at their small farm, the dried-up corn stalks, the broken fence posts, and the barn that seemed ready to fall down any day now. Her father sat on the porch staring at a pile of papers in his hands. Those papers had been there for weeks now. Bills, notices, threats from the bank. Margaret knew what they meant, even though her father tried to hide it from her. They were losing everything. "Papa?" she called out, walking toward the house. "Should I start on the vegetable garden?" Thomas Sullivan looked up at his daughter. At 19, Margaret had grown into a beautiful young woman with kind eyes and gentle hands. She worked harder than most men he knew, never complained, and always found ways to make their simple meals taste like something special. She deserved so much better than this failing farm and a father who couldn't provide for her. "Margaret, come sit with me," he said quietly. Something in his voice made her stomach drop. She had heard that tone before, when her mother died 3 years ago, when the crops failed last summer, when their last cow got sick and died. It was the voice he used when bad news was coming. She sat down on the wooden step beside him, her work dress dusty and worn. "What is it, Papa?" Thomas couldn't look at her directly. Instead, he stared out at the road that led to town. "We got a visitor coming today. Judge William Hartwell." Margaret knew the name. Everyone in the county knew Judge Hartwell. He was a powerful man who owned half the town and had his fingers in every important decision that got made. He was also a widower who lived alone in the biggest house anyone had ever seen. "Why is the judge coming here?" Margaret asked, though part of her already feared the answer. Her father finally turned to look at her, and she saw tears in his eyes. "Margaret, honey, I've tried everything. I've asked everyone for help. The bank won't give us any more time. We're going to lose the farm next month." Margaret felt her world tilting. This farm was all they had left. It was where her mother was, buried where she had grown up, where all her memories lived. "But Papa, maybe we can—" "There's no maybe left," Thomas interrupted gently. "Unless—" He took a deep breath. "Judge Hartwell has made us an offer." The way he said it made Margaret's skin crawl. "What kind of offer?" "He'll pay off all our debts. He'll give me enough money to live comfortably for the rest of my life. The farm will be saved." Margaret waited. There was always a but coming. "In return, he wants you to marry him." The words hit Margaret like a physical blow. She stood up so fast she nearly fell over. "What?" "Margaret, please listen. You want to sell me?" The words came out as a whisper, but they felt like screaming. "It's not like that," her father said quickly. "Judge Hartwell is a good man. He's respected. He can give you things I never could. A big house, nice clothes, a secure future. You'd never have to worry about money again." Margaret began pacing back and forth on the small porch. "Papa, he's older than you are." "Age doesn't matter when there's respect and security," Thomas said, but his voice sounded hollow even to himself. "Does it matter what I want?" Margaret asked. Thomas looked down at his hands. "What choice do we have? If we lose this farm, I'll end up in debtor's prison. You'll have nothing. At least this way, you'll be taken care of." Margaret felt like she couldn't breathe. The world around her seemed to be spinning too fast. "When is he coming?" "This afternoon. He wants to meet you properly." "Meet me or inspect me?" The bitterness in her voice surprised them both. Before her father could answer, they heard the sound of horse hooves on the dirt road. A fancy black carriage was approaching, pulled by 2 beautiful horses that probably cost more than their farm made in a good year. "He's early," Thomas muttered, standing up and straightening his old vest. Margaret watched as the carriage stopped in front of their house. The driver, dressed in a crisp uniform, jumped down and opened the door. Out stepped Judge William Hartwell. EQ was exactly what Margaret had expected. Tall, well-dressed, with silver hair and cold eyes that seemed to calculate the value of everything they looked at. His clothes were expensive, his shoes were shiny, and he carried himself like a man who was used to getting exactly what he wanted. "Mr. Sullivan," Judge Hartwell said, walking toward the porch with confident steps. "Good morning." "Judge Hartwell." "Sir, thank you for coming," Thomas replied, his voice nervous. The judge's eyes moved to Margaret, looking her up and down like she was a horse he was thinking about buying. She felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment and anger. "And this must be Margaret," Judge Hartwell said. His voice was smooth and practiced, like a politician's. "My, you're even lovelier than I was told." Margaret forced herself to nod politely, but she didn't speak. She couldn't trust what might come out of her mouth. "Perhaps we could sit and discuss the arrangements," the judge continued, settling himself into the best chair on the porch without being invited. For the next hour, Margaret listened as her father and Judge Hartwell talked about her future like she wasn't even there. The judge explained how the marriage would benefit his political career. Having a young, beautiful wife would improve his image. He talked about the kind of hostess he expected her to be, the social events she would need to attend, the way she would need to dress and behave. "Of course, she'll need some training in proper etiquette," Judge Hartwell said, glancing at Margaret's simple dress and work-worn hands. "But I'm sure she's trainable." Margaret felt like screaming. "Trainable? Like a dog?" "The wedding will be in 6 weeks," Judge Hartwell announced. "That should give her time to prepare properly. I'll send my housekeeper to help her learn what's expected." He stood up, brushing invisible dust from his expensive suit. "Mr. Sullivan, you'll find the first payment in your account by tomorrow morning. The rest will be transferred the day after the wedding. Payment." Like Margaret was something being bought. Judge Hartwell turned to Margaret one more time. "I look forward to our union, my dear. You'll find that being Mrs. Hartwell comes with many privileges." After he left, Margaret and her father sat in silence for a long time. The sun was getting hotter and the air felt thick and heavy. 6 weeks, Margaret finally said. "I know it's fast, but 6 weeks to say goodbye to my whole life." Thomas reached for her hand, but she pulled away. "Margaret, please understand, I'm doing this for you." "No, Papa. You're doing this for yourself, because it's easier than fighting." She stood up and walked into the house, leaving her father alone on the porch with his pile of bills and his guilty conscience. That night, Margaret lay in her small bed, staring at the ceiling and listening to her father pace the floor in the next room. She thought about her mother, who had married for love and had been happy even when times were hard. She thought about the dreams she used to have, of maybe opening a small school or finding a husband who would love her for who she was, not what she could do for him. Now all of that was gone, sold to pay debts she hadn't made. 6 weeks. 42 days to prepare for a life she didn't want with a man she barely knew. Margaret closed her eyes and tried to imagine herself in Judge Hartwell's big house, wearing fancy dresses and hosting dinner parties for important people. But all she could see was a cage, even if it was made of gold. Outside her window, the wind whispered through the dying corn stalks, and Margaret wondered if this was how it felt to have your heart break into 1,000 pieces. 3 weeks had passed since Judge Hartwell's visit, and Margaret felt like she was slowly disappearing. Every day brought new reminders of her approaching wedding. The judge's housekeeper, Mrs. Peterson, came by twice a week to teach Margaret proper behavior. How to walk like a lady, how to pour tea without making noise, how to smile politely even when she wanted to scream. "Remember, Margaret," Mrs. Peterson would say in her sharp voice, "Judge Hartwell expects perfection. You represent him now." Margaret nodded and practiced her curtsy for the 100th time, feeling more like a trained circus animal than a human being. On this particular morning, her father sent her to town to pick up supplies. Margaret was grateful for any excuse to escape the house and Mrs. Peterson's constant corrections. She hitched up their old wagon and made the dusty trip to town, trying to enjoy what might be one of her last times driving alone. The town was busy with the usual afternoon crowd. Farmers selling vegetables, women shopping for fabric, men discussing business outside the bank. Margaret tied up the wagon and started down the main street toward Miller's General Store. She was so lost in her thoughts about wedding preparations that she didn't notice the commotion happening near the store. A beautiful chestnut horse was rearing up on its back legs, eyes wild with fear. Something had spooked it badly, and it was pulling against its rope, trying to break free. Margaret was walking right toward the panicked animal when it broke loose. The horse came charging straight at her, and Margaret froze. She had worked with horses all her life, but this one was beyond reason. Just when she thought she was about to be trampled, someone grabbed her around the waist and pulled her sideways. They both tumbled to the ground in a heap, rolling in the dirt as the horse thundered past. Margaret found herself lying on top of a stranger, both of them covered in dust and breathing hard. "You all right?" the man asked, his voice deep and calm despite what had just happened. Margaret pushed herself up and looked down at her rescuer. He was young, maybe in his mid-20s, with dark hair that needed cutting and kind brown eyes. His clothes were worn but clean, and his hands were the rough, honest hands of someone who worked hard for everything he had. Yes, I think so," Margaret stammered, suddenly aware that she was still sitting on top of him. She scrambled to her feet, her cheeks burning red. The stranger stood up and brushed the dirt off his clothes. "That horse has been spooked all morning. Old Miller should have warned folks." "Thank you," Margaret said quietly. "You probably saved my life." The man shrugged like it was nothing. "Jake Morrison," he said, holding out his hand. "Margaret Sullivan," she replied, shaking his hand. His grip was firm and warm. Jake looked her over quickly, checking for injuries. "You sure you're not hurt? That was a pretty hard fall." "I'm fine, really. Just a little shaken up." Margaret tried to smooth down her hair and straighten her dress. She probably looked like a mess. "Let me walk you to wherever you were heading," Jake offered, "just in case that horse decides to come back." They walked toward the general store together, and Margaret found herself stealing glances at Jake. There was something different about him. He didn't try to impress her with fancy words or talk about how important he was. He just walked beside her with an easy confidence that made her feel safe. "You work around here?" Margaret asked, trying to make conversation. "I work at the Barrett Ranch, about 10 miles north of town. Been there for 3 years now." Jake held the door of the general store open for her. "What about you? I don't think I've seen you in town before." "I live on a small farm with my father. We don't come to town very often." Margaret didn't mention that after her wedding, she'd be living in the judge's mansion and probably wouldn't be allowed to come to town alone at all. Inside the store, Margaret gathered the supplies on her father's list, while Jake waited patiently. She noticed that other customers nodded respectfully to Jake, and Mr. Miller greeted him warmly. This was clearly a man who was liked and trusted, even if he didn't have much money. "That everything?" Jake asked as Margaret paid for her purchases. "Yes, thank you." Margaret hesitated at the door. For some reason, she didn't want this conversation to end. Jake made her feel like herself again, not like the trained doll she was becoming. "Well, I better get back," Jake said. "Got horses to tend to." They walked back to Margaret's wagon together. Jake helped her load the supplies, his movements careful and efficient. When everything was secured, he stepped back and touched the brim of his hat. "Take care of yourself, Margaret Sullivan," he said with a smile that made her heart skip. "You, too, Jake Morrison." Margaret climbed onto the wagon seat and picked up the reins. As she started to drive away, she looked back and saw Jake still standing there, watching to make sure she got off safely. All the way home, Margaret couldn't stop thinking about those kind brown eyes and the way Jake had said her name like it actually mattered. The next week, Margaret found excuses to go to town twice. She told herself she was just running errands, but deep down she hoped to see Jake again. On her second trip, she spotted him outside the blacksmith's shop, talking to his horse while the blacksmith worked on its shoes. "Easy, girl," Jake was saying, stroking the horse's neck. "I know you don't like the noise, but we need these shoes if we're going to keep working." Margaret watched him for a moment, impressed by his gentle way with the animal. When Jake looked up and saw her, his face broke into that same warm smile. "Well, if it isn't the girl who likes to wrestle with runaway horses," he said, walking over to her wagon. Margaret laughed, and it felt good. She couldn't remember the last time she had really laughed about anything. "I prefer to avoid wrestling with horses, actually." "Smart thinking." Jake leaned against her wagon. "What brings you to town today?" "Oh, just supplies," Margaret said, vaguely. The truth was, she had volunteered to pick up things they didn't really need just for the chance to get away from wedding preparations. Jake studied her face, and Margaret had the feeling he could see right through her excuse. "You look tired," he said gently. Something about the way he said it with real concern in his voice made Margaret's eyes fill with tears. She blinked quickly, trying to hide them. "Hey," Jake said softly. "What's wrong?" Margaret shook her head. "It's nothing, I'm fine. You don't look fine." Jake glanced around the busy street, then back at her. "Come on, let's go somewhere we can talk." Before Margaret could protest, Jake was leading her wagon around to the back of the general store, where a few wooden crates made a quiet place to sit. He helped her down from the wagon and waited while she composed herself. "I'm sorry," Margaret said, wiping her eyes. "I don't usually... I'm not the crying type." "Everybody's the crying type sometimes," Jake said simply. "What's got you so upset?" Margaret looked at this man she barely knew, this stranger who had already saved her once and was now offering to listen to her troubles. There was something about Jake that made her feel like she could trust him with anything. "I'm getting married," she said quietly. Jake's face changed slightly. "Congratulations," he said, but his voice sounded flat. "Don't congratulate me. I don't want to get married?" Jake frowned. "Then why are you doing it?" And suddenly the whole story came pouring out. Margaret told Jake about her father's debts, about Judge Hartwell's offer, about how she was being sold like a piece of property to save the farm. She told him about the etiquette lessons and the fancy dresses and the way the judge looked at her like she was something he owned. Jake listened without interrupting, his face growing darker with each detail. "When's the wedding?" he asked when she finished. 3 weeks. Jake was quiet for a long moment, staring at the ground. When he looked up, his brown eyes were fierce. "You could leave. Just pack up and go somewhere else. And leave my father to face the creditors alone? They'd throw him in prison. So you're sacrificing your whole life for his mistakes?" Margaret bristled. "They're not mistakes. He's just had bad luck. The drought, my mother's medical bills, the failed crops." "I didn't mean to upset you," Jake said quickly. "I just hate to see someone as good as you trapped in something like this." "You don't even know me," Margaret pointed out. "I know enough," Jake said simply. "I know you're brave enough to face down a spooked horse. I know you love your father enough to marry a man you don't care about. I know you're not the kind of person who deserves to be bought and sold." His words made Margaret's heart race. When was the last time someone had called her brave? When had anyone ever talked about what she deserved? "What would you do?" she asked, "if you were me?" Jake thought about it seriously. "I'd probably do exactly what you're doing," he admitted. "Family's everything, but that doesn't mean I'd have to like it." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the afternoon shadows grow longer. Finally, Jake stood up. "I better let you get home before your father starts worrying." He helped Margaret back onto her wagon, his hand lingering on hers, for just a moment longer than necessary. "Margaret," he said as she picked up the reins, "if you ever need someone to talk to, someone who will listen without judging, I'm usually in town on Saturday afternoons." Margaret nodded, not trusting herself to speak. As she drove away, she could feel Jake watching her go, and for the first time in weeks, she didn't feel completely alone. Margaret found herself counting down the days differently now. Instead of dreading each day that brought her closer to the wedding, she looked forward to Saturdays. Every Saturday afternoon, she would find an excuse to go to town, and every Saturday, Jake would be there waiting. They never planned these meetings. Margaret would just happen to need something from the store, and Jake would just happen to be finishing his business in town at the same time. They would end up talking behind the general store or walking down the quiet side streets. And for a few precious hours, Margaret could forget about wedding dresses and etiquette lessons. Jake told her about his life on the Barrett Ranch, about the horses he loved and the dreams he had of maybe owning a small piece of land someday. Margaret told him about her mother's garden, about the books she loved to read, about how she used to dream of teaching children in a little schoolhouse. "You'd be a good teacher," Jake said one Saturday as they sat by the creek that ran behind the church. You've got patience and you explain things real clear. That's not going to happen now, Margaret said, skipping a stone across the water. Judge Hartwell's wife won't be working. Judge Hartwell's wife, Jake repeated, and Margaret could hear the distaste in his voice. That's what you're going to be. Not Margaret Sullivan, not a teacher, not even a person. Just his wife. Jake, please don't. Don't what? Don't point out that you're about to disappear completely? Margaret stood up, suddenly angry. What choice do I have? You keep talking like I could just walk away, but you don't understand. My father will lose everything. He'll go to prison. The farm where my mother is buried will belong to strangers. Jake stood up too, his face serious. And what about you? What happens to Margaret? Margaret doesn't matter. Margaret matters to me. The words hung in the air between them like something fragile and dangerous. They had been dancing around their feelings for weeks, both of them knowing that caring about each other only made everything harder. Jake, Margaret whispered. I know, he said quietly. I know it's too late. I know I don't have any right to feel this way about you. But I can't help it, Margaret. I think about you all the time. I dream about what it would be like if things were different. Margaret felt tears starting in her eyes. Don't say that. Please don't make this harder than it already is. Maybe it should be harder. Maybe you should feel how wrong this is. You think I don't? Margaret's voice cracked. You think I don't lie awake at night wishing I'd met you first? Wishing I had choices? But wishing doesn't change anything, Jake. I'm getting married in 8 days. Jake took a step closer to her. Run away with me. What? Run away with me? We'll go west, find somewhere nobody knows us. I'll work. You can teach if you want to. We'll build something together. Margaret stared at him. Jake, that's crazy. You don't have any money. I don't have anything either. We'd starve. Maybe. Or maybe we'd make it work. People do it all the time. Not people like me. I've never been anywhere but this farm and this town. I don't know how to live like that. I'd teach you. Just like you'd teach me to read better. Jake reached for her hands. Margaret, I'm not asking you to choose an easy life. I'm asking you to choose your own life. Margaret pulled her hands away. And what about my father? What about him? He made his choices. Why should you pay for them? Because he's my father. Because I love him. And he's willing to sell you to pay his debts. Is that love? The words hit Margaret like a slap. She had tried so hard not to think of it that way, but Jake was right. Her father was choosing his comfort over her happiness. I have to go, Margaret said, backing away from Jake. This was a mistake. I shouldn't have been meeting you. Margaret, wait. But she was already running back to her wagon, tears streaming down her face. She drove home faster than she should have, trying to outrun the feelings that Jake's words had stirred up. The next few days passed in a blur of final preparations. The wedding dress hung in Margaret's room like a white ghost, reminding her every morning of what was coming. Judge Hartwell came by twice more, each time more possessive and controlling than before. After we're married, he told Margaret during his last visit, you won't need to concern yourself with household management. Mrs. Peterson will handle all of that. Your job will be to look beautiful and be charming to my guests. What will I do with my time? Margaret asked. Judge Hartwell looked surprised by the question. Do? My dear, you'll be Mrs. William Hartwell. That's quite enough to keep anyone busy. Margaret wanted to scream. Instead, she smiled politely and nodded. The way Mrs. Peterson had taught her. That night, Margaret couldn't sleep. She walked out to her mother's grave behind the house and sat in the grass looking up at the stars. Mama, she whispered, I don't know what to do. I know Papa thinks this is best, but it feels so wrong. I met someone who makes me feel alive. But choosing him means letting Papa down, maybe destroying him completely. The wind rustled through the trees, but her mother's voice didn't come with answers the way it sometimes did in Margaret's dreams. The night before the wedding, Margaret lay in her small bed for the last time, staring at the ceiling and trying to imagine her future. Judge Hartwell's big house, formal dinners, careful conversations with important people who didn't really care about her. a life of comfort and emptiness. She must have finally fallen asleep because she was awakened by a sound outside her window. Someone was throwing pebbles at the glass. Margaret crept to the window and looked out. Jake was standing in the yard below, his horse waiting behind him. When he saw her face in the window, he motioned for her to come down. Margaret grabbed her shawl and slipped quietly out of the house. Her father was sleeping deeply. The doctor had given him something to help him rest before the big day. "What are you doing here?" Margaret whispered as she approached Jake. "I couldn't let you do this without saying goodbye properly," Jake said, "and without making you one last offer." He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a small leather pouch. "I sold everything I owned except my horse and saddle. It's not much, but it's enough to buy a small piece of land up north. Nothing fancy. Just a few acres with a creek running through it." Margaret stared at the pouch. "Jake, I'm leaving tomorrow morning right after your wedding. I can't stay here and watch you belong to someone else." Jake's voice was rough with emotion. "But if you change your mind, if you decide you want to choose your own life instead of the one that's been chosen for you, come with me." "I can't. You can. It's scary, and it's risky, and we might fail completely, but at least we'd fail together, as ourselves." Jake reached for her hand, and this time, Margaret didn't pull away. "I'm not asking you to choose me, Margaret. I'm asking you to choose yourself. Choose the woman who wants to teach children and grow flowers and laugh without asking permission first." Margaret felt like her heart was breaking and mending at the same time. What if we can't make it work? What if we end up with nothing? Then we'll have nothing together, and that's still better than having everything with the wrong person. Jake brought her hand to his lips and kissed it gently. "I'll wait until noon. If you don't come, I'll understand. But if you do come, if you're brave enough to take that chance, I promise I'll spend the rest of my life making sure you never regret it." He climbed back onto his horse and looked down at her one last time. "The choice is yours, Margaret Sullivan. For once in your life, the choice is completely yours." After Jake rode away, Margaret stood in the yard for a long time, the leather pouch heavy in her hands. Inside the house, her wedding dress waited. In a few hours, her father would wake up and prepare for the ceremony that would solve all his problems and end all her dreams. But now there was another choice. A choice that terrified her and thrilled her at the same time. Margaret looked up at the stars one more time, then walked back into the house. In her room, she sat on the edge of her bed with the leather pouch in her lap, watching the first light of dawn creep across the sky. Today was her wedding day. The question was, whose wedding would it be? At 11:30 that morning, as her father waited nervously in the church and Judge Hartwell checked his watch with growing irritation, Margaret made her choice. She left a letter on her pillow, grabbed the small bag she had packed in the dark hours before dawn, and slipped out of the house one last time. Her heart was pounding so hard she thought it might burst, but her steps were steady and sure. At the edge of town, Jake was waiting with 2 horses and a smile that could have lit up the whole world. "I was hoping you'd come," he said simply. "I was hoping I'd be brave enough," Margaret replied. Jake helped her onto the second horse, and together they rode toward the horizon, toward a future they would build with their own hands and their own choices. Behind them, the church bells began to ring, but they were ringing for a bride who had chosen freedom over safety, love over security, and herself over everyone else's expectations. Margaret Sullivan had finally learned to choose. The reality of what Margaret had done didn't hit her until 3 days into their journey north. She was sitting by a small campfire, trying to cook beans in a dented pot that Jake had bought from a traveling merchant, when she realized she had never cooked over an open fire before. She had never slept on the ground, never gone 3 days without a proper bath, never owned just the clothes on her back and nothing more. "Having second thoughts?" Jake asked gently, watching her struggle with the fire. Margaret looked at him, across the flickering flames. His face was dirty from the road. His clothes were wrinkled, and he was eating beans from a tin plate like it was the finest meal in the world. 3 days ago, she would have been sitting down to her wedding dinner on Judge Hartwell's finest china. No, she said firmly. Not second thoughts, just first thoughts about how much I don't know. Jake smiled. Good thing we've got time to learn. They reached the land Jake had bought on a warm afternoon in late summer. It wasn't much to look at, 5 acres of rolling hills with a creek running through the middle and a few scattered oak trees for shade. There was no house, no barn, no fence, just wild grass and endless sky. What do you think? Jake asked, his voice nervous. Margaret climbed down from her horse and walked to the center of the property. She had grown up on a farm, but that farm had been built by her grandfather. This land was completely empty, waiting for someone to imagine its future. I think, Margaret said slowly, it's perfect. They were married the next week by a traveling preacher in the nearest town. Margaret wore her simple blue dress, and Jake wore his only clean shirt. There were no flowers, no fancy cake, no guests. Just 2 people promising to build a life together from nothing but love and determination. The first months were harder than anything Margaret had ever imagined. Jake built them a 1-room cabin with his own hands, working from sunrise to sunset, while Margaret tried to figure out how to cook, clean, and keep house with almost no supplies. Their bed was a mattress stuffed with grass. Their table was made from a tree stump. They had 2 plates, 2 cups, and 1 fork between them. Margaret's hands, which had been soft from her protected life on her father's farm, became rough and calloused. She learned to milk the cow Jake bought from a neighbor, to churn butter, to preserve vegetables for winter. She learned to patch clothes and make soap and stretch a dollar until it cried for mercy. I never knew how hard women worked, Jake said one evening, watching Margaret mend his torn shirt by candlelight. My mother always made it look easy. It is hard, Margaret admitted, but it's different when you're working for yourself instead of working because you have to. Winter came early that year, and it came hard. Snow piled up against their little cabin, and the wind howled through the gaps in the walls that Jake hadn't had time to properly seal. They huddled together under every blanket they owned, sharing warmth and trying to make their stored food last until spring. Margaret, Jake said one particularly cold night, I'm sorry I can't give you more than this. Margaret looked around their tiny cabin. It was cold, it was small, and it was a far cry from the luxury she would have had as Judge Hartwell's wife. But it was theirs. Every board in the walls, every nail in the floor, every improvement they made, it all belonged to them. Don't you dare apologize, she said fiercely. This is ours, Jake. We built this with our own hands. That matters more than anything money could buy. But the isolation was hard. They were 20 miles from the nearest town, and their closest neighbors were the Hendersons, a family who lived 5 miles away. Margaret missed having other women to talk to. She missed her father, even though she was still angry with him. She missed the feeling of being part of a community. The loneliness got worse when news reached them about what had happened after their escape. Judge Hartwell, humiliated by being left at the altar, had used his influence to make life difficult for Margaret's father. He foreclosed on the farm anyway, claiming that the marriage contract had been broken. Thomas Sullivan lost everything and had to move in with his sister in another county. He hates me, Margaret said when they got the news. My own father hates me. He's embarrassed, Jake said, holding her while she cried. Give him time. What if he never forgives me? Then that's his loss, Jake said firmly. You can't live your whole life trying to make up for other people's bad choices. Spring brought new challenges. Their first attempt at planting crops was a disaster. They planted too late, chose the wrong seeds for their soil, and lost half their crop to insects they didn't know how to fight. They survived on what Jake earned doing odd jobs for neighboring farms and what Margaret made selling eggs and butter in town. We're terrible farmers, Margaret said, looking at their pathetic vegetable garden. We're learning farmers, Jake corrected. Next year will be better. Some days Margaret wondered if they were going to make it. Money was always tight. Something was always breaking, and the work never seemed to end. She would see other women in town wearing nice dresses and living in proper houses, and she would feel a stab of envy. But then she would come home to find Jake working on some new improvement to their cabin or their land, whistling while he worked because he was building something for their future. She would see the way his face lit up when she came home from town, the way he asked about her day and really listened to the answer. She would remember what it felt like to make choices together instead of having choices made for her. "Do you ever regret it?" Jake asked her one evening as they sat on the porch of their little cabin, watching the sunset over their land. "Regret what?" "This. Us. Choosing this life instead of the easy one." Margaret thought about it seriously. Their hands were dirty from working in the garden. Their clothes were patched and faded. Their dinner had been beans and cornbread again, because they couldn't afford meat. Tomorrow would bring more work, more problems, more challenges to figure out together. "Never," she said, and meant it completely. The turning point came in their second year. Margaret had started teaching the Henderson children and 2 other neighbor families, holding classes in their cabin 3 days a week. It wasn't much money, but it was something Margaret loved doing, and it brought in enough to buy better seeds for their garden. Jake had learned enough about farming to have a decent crop, and he had also started breaking horses for other ranchers. Word was getting around that Jake Morrison was honest, hardworking, and good with animals. "We're going to make it," Margaret said one evening, looking at their small savings jar that was actually starting to have money in it. "We're going to do more than make it," Jake said. "We're going to build something good here." By the end of their second year, their cabin had a real wooden floor instead of dirt. They had glass in their windows instead of oiled paper. Margaret had a proper stove instead of the fireplace, and Jake had built her a kitchen table that was level and steady. It wasn't luxury, but it was progress. More importantly, it was theirs. Margaret started getting letters from women in town, asking if she would teach their children too. Word had spread that the young woman living on the Morrison place was educated and patient and had a way with children that made them actually want to learn. "You could start a real school," Jake suggested. "Build it right here on our land." Could we afford it? We could save up, take our time, do it right. Margaret imagined it, a little schoolhouse with real desks and a bell and children coming from all over the county to learn. It seemed like an impossible dream. But then again, 2 years ago, having their own land had seemed impossible too. The hardest part wasn't the work, or the money, or even the isolation. The hardest part was the way some people in town looked at them. Margaret had disgraced herself by running away from Judge Hartwell, and some folks never let her forget it. "That's the girl who left Judge Hartwell at the altar," she heard a woman whisper at the general store. "No shame at all." "Poor judgment," another woman replied. "Could have had everything, and she threw it away for a ranch hand." Margaret kept her head high and her voice polite, but the words stung. Jake got his share of comments too, men who questioned his honor, who suggested he had stolen another man's bride, who acted like he wasn't good enough to be in the same room as them. "Let them talk," Jake said when Margaret told him about the whispers. "We know who we are. We know what we've built together. Their opinions don't change that." Judge Hartwell himself made things difficult whenever he could. He tried to have Jake charged with theft for taking Margaret away. He spread rumors about their character. He used his influence to make sure they didn't get credit at certain stores in town. But for every person who judged them, there was someone else who admired what they were doing. The Henderson family became close friends. Other young couples, inspired by Jake and Margaret's courage, started making their own independent choices instead of accepting arranged marriages. "You know what you've done?" old Mrs. Patterson told Margaret one day at the store. "You've shown the young women around here that they don't have to accept whatever their fathers decide for them. That takes courage." At night, lying in their narrow bed in their tiny cabin, Margaret and Jake would make plans for the future. They would talk about expanding their land, building a bigger house. 5 years after Margaret chose love over security, she stood in the doorway of their home watching Jake teach their 4-year-old son how to sit properly on a horse. Their daughter, barely 2 years old, clapped her hands from her spot on the porch, cheering every time her brother managed to stay in the saddle for more than a few seconds. "Look, Mama," little Tommy called out. "I'm riding all by myself." "I see that, sweetheart," Margaret called back, smiling at the pure joy on her son's face. You're doing wonderfully." The home Margaret watched from was no longer the tiny one-room cabin where she and Jake had started their life together. Over the years, Jake had added room after room, expanding their house as their family and their prosperity grew. They now had a proper parlor, a real kitchen with modern conveniences, 3 bedrooms, and even a small library where Margaret kept her teaching materials and her growing collection of books. Their land had grown too. What started as 5 acres was now 20, with good pasture for Jake's horses, a thriving vegetable garden that supplied much of their food, and the little schoolhouse that had been Margaret's dream for so many years. The Morrison School, as folks called it, served children from all over the county. Margaret taught reading, writing, arithmetic, and geography to nearly 30 students who came from as far as 15 miles away. Some of the older boys boarded with neighboring families during the week just so they could attend Margaret's classes. "Mrs. Morrison makes learning feel like an adventure," one of her students had told his parents. "She tells us stories about the places we read about, and she makes numbers make sense." But the real measure of what Margaret and Jake had built wasn't in the size of their house or the success of the school. It was in the respect they had earned from their community and the happiness that filled their daily lives. Jake had become known throughout the county as the best horse trainer for 3 counties around. Men traveled from far away to have Jake work with their difficult horses, and his reputation for fairness and skill had brought them enough prosperity to live comfortably. "You've got a gift," old rancher Bill Henderson had told Jake just last week. "Never seen anyone gentle a horse the way you do. You don't break their spirit, you just teach them to trust." Margaret often thought that was true about Jake's approach to everything. He didn't force or demand. He earned trust through patience and consistency. On this particular morning, as she watched her husband and children, Margaret was expecting a visitor. Word had come that her father was finally ready to see her again. Thomas Sullivan had spent the last 5 years living with his sister, working as a bookkeeper for a small business in town. He had never remarried, never rebuilt the life he had lost. According to Margaret's aunt, he spent most of his time regretting the choices he had made and the daughter he had lost. "He's sick, Margaret," her aunt had written. "The doctor says his heart is failing. He asks about you constantly, but he's too proud to reach out. If you want to see him again, it should be soon." Margaret had written back immediately, inviting her father to come stay with them for as long as he needed. She had been nervous about Jake's reaction. After all, Thomas Sullivan was the man who had tried to sell his daughter to pay his debts. "Of course he should come," Jake had said without hesitation. "He's your father and he's the children's grandfather. Besides, a man deserves a chance to make things right before it's too late." That was Jake, always believing the best of people, always willing to forgive. Margaret heard the sound of a wagon approaching and knew her father had arrived. Her heart started beating faster as she smoothed her dress and checked her appearance in the mirror. Would he approve of what she had become? Would he see that she had made the right choice? Or would he still be disappointed in her? Jake helped Tommy down from the horse and came to stand beside Margaret as the wagon pulled up to their house. The man who climbed down from the driver's seat looked much older than the father Margaret remembered. Thomas Sullivan's hair was completely gray now. His shoulders were stooped and he moved like someone who was carrying a heavy burden. But when he looked at Margaret, his eyes filled with tears. "My dear girl," he whispered. "Look at you." Margaret ran to him and threw her arms around him, and for a moment they were just a father and daughter who had missed each other terribly. "I'm so sorry, Margaret," Thomas said, his voice breaking. "I'm so sorry for what I tried to do to you." "Papa, it's all right," Margaret said, though she was crying too. "You're here now. That's what matters." Jake stepped forward and extended his hand to his father-in-law. "Mr. Sullivan, sir, welcome to our home." Thomas looked at Jake for a long moment, taking in his honest face, his work-worn hands, his respectful manner. Then he shook Jake's hand firmly. "I owe you an apology too, son," Thomas said. "I thought you were stealing my daughter away from a good life. I can see now that you were saving her from a terrible one." Over the next few days, Thomas got to know the family that Margaret and Jake had built together. He watched Jake work with the horses, patient and gentle but firm. He saw how Jake treated Margaret, not like a possession or a decoration, but like a true partner whose opinions mattered and whose happiness was important. He observed Margaret teaching her students, seeing how she had found a way to use her education and her natural gifts in a way that made a real difference in their community. He played with his grandchildren, marveling at how confident and happy they were. "You did it," Thomas told Margaret one evening as they sat on the porch, watching Jake and the children play in the yard. "You built exactly the kind of life your mother always dreamed of for you." "It wasn't easy," Margaret admitted. "There were times when I wondered if we would make it, times when I missed the comfort and security that Judge Hartwell could have given me." "But you don't regret it?" Margaret looked at her husband, who was now carrying both children on his shoulders while they shrieked with laughter. She thought about their cozy home, her beloved school, the respect they had earned in their community, and the deep satisfaction that came from building something with your own hands and your own choices. "Never," she said firmly. "Not for a single moment." Thomas was quiet for a while, watching his son-in-law play with the grandchildren he was just getting to know. "Judge Hartwell remarried, you know," he said finally. "I heard. A young girl from back east, barely 18. Her father owed him money too." Thomas shook his head sadly. "I see her sometimes in town. She looks exactly like you did when you were engaged to him, trapped, miserable, like a bird in a cage." Margaret felt a pang of sympathy for the girl who was living the life she had escaped. Maybe she'll find her courage too someday. Maybe. But not everyone is as brave as you, daughter. The word daughter made Margaret's heart swell. She had been afraid that her father would never forgive her, never accept her choices. But here he was, seeing her life clearly, and finally, understanding what she had tried to tell him all those years ago. Thomas stayed with them for 3 weeks, growing stronger and happier every day. He helped Margaret with the school, reading to the younger children and sharing stories from his own youth. He worked alongside Jake, learning about horses and discovering that there was dignity in working with your hands. "I never understood," he told Jake one day as they mended a fence together. "I thought success meant having enough money to avoid work, but there's satisfaction in this kind of work that I never found in a ledger book." Jake smiled. "Margaret taught me that too. She says the best kind of security comes from knowing you can take care of yourself, not from having someone else take care of you." On the day Thomas was preparing to leave, Margaret walked with him to his wagon. He was going back to his sister's house, but he looked healthier and more at peace than he had in years. "I want you to know," Thomas said, taking Margaret's hands in his. "I'm proud of you. Proud of the woman you became. Proud of the life you chose. Proud of the family you've raised. Your mother would be proud too." "Thank you, Papa. That means everything to me." Thomas climbed into his wagon, then looked back at the life his daughter had built. The house that had grown from a tiny cabin into a proper home. The school where children came to learn and grow. The pastures where beautiful horses grazed peacefully. The family that was built on love and respect instead of obligation and duty. "You know what you proved, Margaret," Thomas said. "You proved that sometimes the person who offers you nothing but their hand is offering you everything that really matters." As Margaret watched her father drive away, Jake came up behind her and put his arms around her waist. The children were napping inside, and for a moment they had the rare luxury of quiet time together. "Any regrets?" Jake asked, just like he had so many times over the years. Margaret leaned back against her husband's chest and looked out over the land they had built together. Their life wasn't perfect. They still had to work hard for everything they had, still faced challenges and setbacks. But it was theirs, earned through their own efforts and choices. "None," Margaret said, meaning it with her whole heart. "Not a single one." That evening, as Margaret tucked her children into their beds, Tommy asked her the question he asked every night. "Tell us the story, Mama. Tell us about how you and Papa met."